What happened to V-1 flying bomb, the first cruise missile suicide UAV after World War II? My name is Knightley, and for as long as I can remember, I've been drawn to the echoes of war, the machines, the decisions, the inventions that changed everything. Historians often say that weapons are reflections of the era that built them. Former RAF pilot and historian Group Captain Peter Stoddart once remarked, "You cannot study the V-weapons without understanding the fear they carved into the sky." And in the words of German engineer Walter Thiel, whose wartime notes survive in archival fragments, the V-1 was a desperate weapon for a desperate time. These aren't just cold machines to me, they're chapters of humanity's darkest, most transformative moments. And today we explore one of the most iconic, the V-1 flying bomb, the world's first true cruise missile, and arguably the first mass-produced suicide UAV. Eyewitnesses from London recalled the chilling sound of its pulse jet engine, the infamous buzzing followed by an abrupt silence. A retired British civil defence volunteer once said, "When the engine stopped, you had 10 seconds to pray." Imagine living in that tension day after day. But here's the question that brought you to this story. What happened to the V-1 after the war ended? Where did the surviving units go? Did Allied nations destroy them, or secretly rebuild and study them? How did this crude early drone shape the terrifying missile age that followed? Today we dig into all of it. So welcome, my friends, I'm Knightley, and I invite you to join me as we uncover the hidden afterlife of the V-1, the flying bomb that refused to disappear, even after the guns fell silent. Are you ready? Then let's begin our journey into the fate of the world's first cruise missile. The rise and legacy of the V-1 flying bomb before the war ended, the birth of a legend. The V-1 flying bomb was never intended to be just another weapon. It was forged with a single purpose: to change a war that Germany was rapidly losing. In the early 1940s, as Allied air superiority tightened its grip, German command searched desperately for a strategic equalizer. Historian Michael Neufeld from the Smithsonian once wrote, "The V-weapons were born from the belief that technology could compensate for collapsing fronts." And the V-1, simple, brutal, mass-producible, was the embodiment of that belief. Its development began quietly in 1939 under the codename Fieseler V-103, with Luftwaffe engineers and scientists experimenting with pulse jet propulsion, a technology barely understood at the time. The airframe was intentionally minimalistic: wooden wings, a steel fuselage, and an Argus a 014 engine that pulsed at over 40 times per second. This crude heartbeat produced the iconic buzzing sound, part mechanical, part monstrous, that would define the weapon's legacy. Politically, it was a promise, a weapon that could be built cheaply and launched en masse to terrorize enemy cities without risking pilots. Militarily, it was a gamble, a flying bomb guided only by gyroscopes and rudimentary autopilot. But for a Germany running out of fuel, pilots, and time, it was a gamble they embraced fully. A weapon designed for one purpose. The V-1 was created not as a precision tool, but as a psychological hammer. It did not discriminate, it did not maneuver. It followed a preset course until its fuel ran dry, and then it fell. Former German officer Hans Kammler described it bluntly. Its purpose was to make the enemy bleed fear. And in the atmosphere of total war, fear was a strategic resource. The environment that created the V-1 was a crucible of pressure. Allied bombing campaigns were crippling factories, oil reserves were collapsing, and morale on every front was deteriorating. Germany needed something that could strike back fast, cheap, and relentlessly. Thus the V-1 was born half aircraft, half missile, and entirely a product of desperation. First combat deployments. The first combat deployment came on June 13, 1944, barely a week after D-Day. At 4:25 a.m., the first V-1 roared across the English Channel. Londoners heard the buzz bomb long before they saw it. When it hit, the explosion shook the district of Bethnal Green, killing 8, injuring 30. For the soldiers and civilians who encountered it, the experience was surreal. It didn't dive like a plane or whistle like artillery. It simply droned forward until, suddenly, the engine stopped. That silence became one of the most feared sounds of the war. A Royal Observer Corps member recalled, You froze, you counted, and you waited for the world to explode. The Allies reacted with a mixture of shock and calculated urgency. Anti-aircraft units scrambled to adapt, creating new fire zones dedicated solely to intercepting V-1s. Fighter pilots, particularly those flying Spitfires and Tempests, developed terrifyingly precise interception techniques, including the now famous wing tipping, where a pilot nudged a V-1 off balance to crash it prematurely. But even as defenses improved, the psychological effect was undeniable. The V-1 was not accurate enough to change the course of the war, but it was more than accurate enough to terrify millions. Enemy adaptation and countermeasures. Within weeks, the Allies deployed one of the most concentrated anti-air networks ever constructed. Balloons, radar-guided guns, barrage lines, and night fighters. Records from the UK's air defence of Great Britain indicate that at the height of the campaign, over 2,000 guns were dedicated solely to the V-1 threat. Yet Germany continued launching them at a staggering rate, sometimes hundreds per day. Each one was a reminder that war had reached a new technological era, one where machines, not pilots, delivered death from the sky. Peak influence. By late summer 1944, the V-1 flying bomb had become an icon of terror. It represented a kind of warfare no one had truly seen before, a precursor to modern drones, cruise missiles, and unmanned kamikaze platforms. Its influence peaked during Operation Penguin, the sustained bombardment campaign against London and later Antwerp. Statistics reveal a chilling picture. Over 9,500 V-1s were launched at the United Kingdom. London alone was hit by over 2,400. Casualties exceeded 22,000, including thousands killed. But beyond numbers, what made the V-1 feared was something more primal. It blurred the line between machine and threat. It didn't negotiate, it didn't hesitate. It simply came. Military historian Basil Collier captured it perfectly. The V-1 was a promise of what the future of warfare would look like, remote, relentless, and indifferent, and, despite its simplicity, it forced the Allies to divert enormous resources. Fighter squadrons, anti-aircraft units, radar operators, all were stretched thin. In this sense, even when the V-1 failed as a strategic weapon, it succeeded as a tactical burden. Turning points and limitations. However, the V-1's weaknesses were equally defining. Its guidance was crude, its range limited, its pulse jet fragile and inefficient. Many failed on launch, and many more were intercepted. Engineers knew this. Documents found in German archives show internal frustration pressure from leadership far outpaced the weapon's capabilities, yet propaganda painted every launch as a triumph. For a brief moment, the V-1 embodied both Germany's technological ambition and its military desperation. Collapse of the old world. As the war neared its end, the strategic value of the V-1 changed dramatically. Factories were bombed into rubble, launch sites in France and the Low Countries were overrun, fuel shortages crippled production, and the Luftwaffe, once feared, was now a skeleton force. The V-1 was no longer a symbol of defiance, it became a symbol of collapse. Production lines slowed, then stopped. Launch ramps were abandoned. Engineers fled or were captured. By spring 1945, most remaining V-1 sites existed only on paper. Technology evolved too. Germany threw its remaining resources into the more advanced V-2 rocket and engineering marvel, but one arriving far too late to alter destiny. And then, as the final days closed in, something extraordinary happened. The buzzing stopped. Not because the weapon had served its purpose, but because the world around it was falling apart. The war ended. The skies fell silent. The V-1's reign of terror was over, but its story was not. Its afterlife, hidden in laboratories, scrapyards, secret archives, and forgotten bunkers, was only beginning. The war ends. The fate of the V-1 flying bomb begins chaos of surrender and seizure. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, the end was anything but orderly. Across Europe, weapons lay scattered like bones of a dying giant abandoned, half-finished, hidden or forgotten. Among them were hundreds of V-1 flying bombs, some intact, some disassembled, some lying in tunnels the Allies had never even known existed. In the forests of the Harz Mountains, Allied reconnaissance teams stumbled upon crates of V-1 components stacked in cold underground factories, silent relics waiting for missions that would never come. At Peenemünde, the Luftwaffe's test center, entire assembly lines still held rows of unfinished fuselages. A British officer wrote in his diary, "It felt as if the workers had vanished seconds before we walked in." In Denmark, Norway and the Netherlands, the Germans had hidden launch ramps in dunes and coastal forests. When the surrender came, many were abandoned fully loaded. Soldiers from the British 21st Army Group recounted discovering V-1s on ramps with fuel already pumped, an eerie reminder of how close Europe had remained to further bombardment. Ports held crates of spare pulse jet engines. Mountain bunkers hid gyroscopic guidance systems. Each discovery came with the same sense of shock. The scale of Germany's secret weapons program was far greater than anyone imagined. The Allies move in. American, British and Soviet units rushed to secure V-1 stockpiles before rival powers could claim them. Every faction wanted the technology, even if the war had ended. The V-1 had proven that an unmanned flying weapon could cross borders, strike cities, and terrorize populations. That alone made it priceless. A U.S. intelligence officer described the atmosphere as a treasure hunt conducted in the ruins of a fallen empire. This was the beginning of the V-1's second life, not as a weapon but as a trophy, a blueprint, a bargaining chip. The power vacuum. Germany's unconditional surrender created a power vacuum filled with suspicion, urgency, and ambition. The Allies did not just want victory, they wanted control of the future. That meant controlling Germany's technology. The question every nation asked was simple: what do we do with all this? Many V-1s were ordered destroyed. The British Ministry of Aircraft Production initially recommended scrapping all captured units to prevent any reconstruction of Nazi weaponry. However, this decision quickly collided with a new reality. The United States and the Soviet Union were already shipping captured rocket technology back home. The British reconsidered. The French hesitated. Smaller Allied nations scrambled to claim leftovers before the giants took everything. Rivalries within the victory. The post-war alliance was fragile, and beneath the smiles for newspapers lay mistrust. American and Soviet intelligence teams often arrived at the same sites within hours of each other. One Soviet engineer later recalled, "You could feel the tension. We were allies in name, competitors in purpose." The V-1 became part of this rivalry. It was no longer a German weapon, it was a bargaining chip in the race for global influence. The Soviets hauled V-1 fuselages to secret facilities east of Moscow. The Americans loaded pulse jet engines onto ships bound for New Jersey. The British transported captured units to Farnborough for immediate testing. Everyone wanted a piece of the future. The technology race begins. The dismantling of V-1 units became a scientific autopsy. Engineers took apart the pulse jet engine, studied the crude gyroscopic autopilot, examined the fuel system, and measured flight characteristics. Each nation wanted to know how a weapon so simple could be so terrifyingly effective. American scientists at Wright Field called it mechanical minimalism, a weapon that achieved maximum impact with minimal design complexity. They quickly understood that the V-1's value wasn't in precision, but in scalability. It could be built cheaply, launched in waves, and overwhelm defenses through sheer volume. The Soviets took a different approach. They admired the V-1's ruggedness and began experimenting with improved versions capable of longer range and better accuracy. Within a few years, the USSR produced its own derivative, the 10 kHz cruise missile prototype. Meanwhile, Britain used captured V-1s to refine anti-air doctrines. Understanding the weapon meant understanding how to defeat the next generation. The French, though recovering from occupation, quietly revived research on pulse jet propulsion technology they had lacked before the war. Even Canada, Poland and Czechoslovakia acquired scrap components, studying them for academic and military purposes. The V-1 was no longer a Nazi secret. It had become the seed of post-war missile development. Reverse engineering and experimentation. Testing grounds across the world lit up with new experiments. At White Sands Proving Ground in the US, Modified V-1s thundered across the desert sky. American engineers tested aluminum wings, improved guidance, and alternate fuels. Soviet engineers launched prototypes near Kapustin Yar, observing how the weapon behaved in different climates. The British tested captured units off the coast of Suffolk, using them as both offensive platforms and as targets to improve radar-based interception. Each experiment carried the same conclusion. The sky was entering a new era, an era where unmanned weapons would redefine warfare. A weapon becomes a blueprint. As tests continued, the V-1 transformed from a terror weapon into a stepping stone. Its flaws became lessons. Its strengths became foundations. Its influence seeped into missile programs, drone experiments, and early Cold War doctrine. Military historian Eric Larson noted, the significance of the V-1 was not the damage it caused, but the future it revealed. By 1947, nearly every major power had produced a V-1-inspired prototype. Cruise missile research surged, autonomous flight experiments grew, and secret programs expanded behind closed doors. The technology race was now unstoppable. Transition to the future. The V-1 had been born in desperation, deployed in chaos, and abandoned in defeat. But in the laboratories and proving grounds of the post-war world, it found new life. Its pulse-jet heartbeat no longer terrified cities, but it echoed through the halls of governments, the minds of engineers, and the strategies of generals. Germany had unleashed the world's first cruise missile. The Allies would create the thousands that followed. What had once been a weapon of war was now a blueprint for the future. Where did they all go? When the last shots of World War II faded, the V-1 flying bomb, once the terror of London and Antwerp, entered a new, far more complex afterlife. Some were destroyed, some were taken, some became test subjects, a few became museum relics, and many simply vanished into forests, oceans, and forgotten fields. This is the story of what happened to every V-1 that survived the war. Scrapped for resources. In the immediate post-war years, few nations valued old German weapons. Europe lay in ruins, factories smashed, railroads twisted, entire cities reduced to ash. What people desperately needed was steel, copper, aluminum knot bombs. British industrial planners quickly realized that thousands of tons of metal were locked inside captured V-1 stockpiles. In the summer of 1945, a directive from the Ministry of Supply encouraged the rapid dismantling of German weapons for raw materials. A similar movement spread across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. A French metallurgical engineer later recalled, "We saw the V-1 not as a weapon, but as a pile of metal ready to feed the furnaces." Hundreds of V-1 fuselages were cut apart by torches. Pulse jet engines, once the snarling heart of a terror weapon, were melted down and turned into girder supports, train parts, even household cookware. Control surfaces became scrap used in rebuilding bridges and war-damaged factories. In some areas of Germany, locals were paid to dismantle and deliver metal from abandoned launch ramps and storage depots. Entire fields of forgotten V-1 wings vanished overnight into recycling plants. A British colonel noted with dry humor, "In 1944, the V-1 was the fear of London. By 1946, it was holding up our railway stations. Most V-1s did not survive even a year after the war ended. By 1947, the majority had disappeared into the industrial rebirth of modern Europe." Captured by major Allied powers. Yet the scrap metal story was only the beginning. The world's major powers saw the V-1 not as garbage, but as opportunity. United States. The Americans moved aggressively. Under Operation Lusty, U.S. Army Air Force's intelligence teams seized dozens of complete V-1s and hundreds of components. Within months, crates of fuselages and engines were shipped across the Atlantic. At Wright Field and White Sands Proving Ground, engineers rebuilt the weapon under the name JB-2 Loon. The U.S. Navy launched them from ships. The Air Force dropped them from B-17 bombers. The Army tested them on mobile ramps. Though never used in combat, the JB-2 program provided essential early data for America's cruise missile and drone experiments. Soviet Union. The USSR captured an equally large share. Soviet engineers took intact V-1s from Poland, East Germany, and the Baltic. They reverse-engineered the weapon almost immediately. By 1947, the Soviets were testing their own derivative, the 10K Kapustin Yar. Although it suffered accuracy issues, it paved the way for later Soviet cruise missiles and remote-controlled aircraft. A Soviet general later remarked, "The V-1 showed us what was possible, an unmanned aircraft that could strike without risking a pilot." United Kingdom. Britain was the first nation to face the V-1 in combat and the first to systematically test captured units. At the RAF's Farnborough facility, engineers flew dozens of test launches to refine radar tracking, jet propulsion research, and anti-air tactics. The British even used captured V-1s to train anti-aircraft crews, firing them across designated corridors so new gunners could practice intercepting them in realistic conditions. France, though recovering from occupation, quietly built its own post-war pulse jet programs. French engineers studied captured components and tested propulsion systems near Toulon and Biscarrosse. Though France never produced a direct V-1 copy, the research influenced early UAV experiments in the 1950s. Other nations. Canada conducted academic studies on pulse jets for aeronautical engineering. Poland and Czechoslovakia salvaged V-1 parts for technical training and analysis. China received V-1 type designs indirectly through Soviet cooperation in the late 1940s. In short, the V-1 became a global phenomenon, dissected and studied on every continent touched by the war. Secret programs. But not all V-1s went to official test sites. Some disappeared into the shadows. Black site research facilities. Both the United States and the Soviet Union funneled captured V-1s into classified programs. These facilities were hidden behind military fences and buried under layers of secrecy. In the US, several V-1s bypassed public testing and were handed directly to clandestine air technical intelligence units studying remote-controlled weapons for future covert operations. In the USSR, the GRU and NKVD raced to extract every possible military application, including proposals to modify the V-1 as a naval strike weapon. Covert experiments, documents declassified decades later, reveal experiments involving extended-range fuselages, radio guidance upgrades, interchangeable warhead modules, launch sequences from submarines, high-altitude variants. None reached production, but each experiment pushed the idea of unmanned warfare forward. Historian Dr. Rebecca Givens stated, "It was not that nations loved the V-1, it was that they feared falling behind." The V-1's simplicity made it a perfect test bed for secret experimentation. Cheap, disposable, unmanned. A military planner's dream. Some of these modified units were eventually scrapped. Others remained classified and vanished into locked warehouses. A few may still lie forgotten in closed military depots today. Museum preservation. Only a tiny fraction of V-1 flying bombs survived long enough to be rescued as historical artifacts. The path to museums across Europe and North America expressed early interest in preserving examples of the V weapons, not to glorify them, but to educate future generations. Many surviving fuselages were pieced together from training shells, incomplete stockpiles, or reconstructed components. Curators often struggled to find complete examples because so many units had been destroyed or cannibalized after the war. Conservators faced challenges. Pulse jet engines corroded quickly, wooden parts decayed, guidance gyros seized, steel fuselages rusted under storage dampness. Restoration often took years. Why they were preserved, veterans argued strongly for preserving at least a few. They believed the V-1 represented not just a German weapon, but a symbol of technological evolution, a warning of how war changes, the dawn of unmanned, long-range attack systems. Some examples were left intentionally unrestored, displayed outdoors as decaying monuments, a reminder of the destruction they caused. Today, only a few dozen V-1s exist in museums around the world. Battlefield relics and abandoned survivors. Even after massive scrapping operations, fragments of V-1s lingered across Europe. Hikers in German forests occasionally found rusted engine mounts or shattered fuselage fragments. In the Netherlands, farmers ploughing fields unearthed debris from crash sites. In Denmark, remnants lay buried near former launch ramps along the coast. swamps and forests. Some V-1s crashed into marshlands and were swallowed by mud. Decades later, divers in Poland and northern Germany discovered corroded pieces beneath lakes and rivers, silent metal skeletons trapped in cold water. Military bases, abandoned Cold War test ranges, still contain buried fragments of both German and Allied modified V-1s. Access to these sites is restricted, and much remains hidden beneath soil and concrete. Underwater wrecks. Several British ships carrying captured V-1 components sank in the North Sea during post-war transport. Modern sonar scans have detected large metallic shapes consistent with disassembled V-1 crates, rumors and skeletons of the past. Every year, relic hunters claim to find V-1 parts, engine nozzles, fuel tanks, tail fins. Many are genuine, others are misidentified, but the truth remains: the landscape of Europe still holds the quiet remains of the world's first cruise missile. Fragments of a weapon that shook cities now rest beneath moss, mud and seawater, mute reminders of a war long past. Before the world moved on, before missiles became sleek and guided by satellites, the V-1 left fingerprints everywhere, on technology, on culture, on politics. Its remnants scattered, its influence endured. Impact on the post-war world. When the Second World War came to a close, the V-1 flying bomb didn't simply vanish into the ashes of the defeated Reich. Instead, its blueprint, its philosophy spread across the globe. Nations that had just witnessed the terror of the buzz bomb understood one thing instantly. This was the beginning of a new kind of warfare. Low-cost, pilotless, expendable, and capable of punching far above its technological simplicity, the V-1 had rewritten the rules. The post-war world absorbed its lessons quickly, and the ripples of that absorption shaped missile development, Cold War strategy, and even modern drone warfare. The first and most immediate impact was technological inheritance. The Allied powers rushed to seize German engineers, documents, and intact examples of V-1s. The British launched Operation Surgeon and Operation Backfire to test, dissect, and catalogue the weapons operation. The Americans, through Operation Paperclip, acquired both expertise and hardware, including Argus pulse-jet specialists. The Soviets took their share from occupied zones. Everyone wanted the same thing: a shortcut to understanding the future of unmanned long-range weapons. The result was a rapid proliferation of post-war V-1 derivatives. The United States produced the JB-2 Loon, a nearly identical copy of the V-1 built by Republic Aviation. It was tested from Florida and the Pacific, even considered for a potential invasion of Japan had the war dragged on. Although the JB-2 never entered combat, its data fed directly into the evolution of early cruise missiles and the foundational principles behind later weapons like the Regulus, Matador, and eventually the sophisticated Tomahawk. The lesson was simple: standoff weapons could now be mass-produced, guided, and launched without risking pilots. Across the Atlantic, Britain continued its own experiments with captured V-1s, integrating them into early Cold War air defense research. The pulse jet itself did not become a major propulsion method in advanced weapons. Its inefficiency and vulnerability were too limiting. But the V-1's inexpensive modular structure deeply influenced post-war thinking about unmanned expendables. From training targets to reconnaissance drones, Western engineers found that the philosophy of cheap, fast, pilotless fit perfectly into Cold War mass production doctrine. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union produced the 10Ks, a V-1-inspired missile tested extensively by the Red Army. Although the Soviets ultimately shifted toward more advanced turbojet-powered cruise missiles, the 10Ka's program still played an important role. It was the USSR's first serious venture into unmanned long-range attack systems. Without the V-1, their cruise missile programs would have started years later and at far greater cost. But the V-1's impact wasn't only technological, it was also psychological. For military strategists, the flying bomb proved that terror from the sky no longer required fleets of bombers or precision-trained pilots. A single launch ramp and a stockpile of crude missiles could induce massive civilian panic, disrupt logistics, and force enemy nations to divert huge resources to air defense. London had done exactly that during the war. Afterward, Military planners from Washington to Moscow understood what this meant. Any future conflict could begin with waves of unmanned weapons designed to paralyze defenses before traditional bombing even started. This idea fed directly into the development of early Cold War air defense networks. Radar coverage, interceptor doctrines, and even the placement of early SAM, surface-to-air missile sites, were shaped by lessons learned during the fight against the V-1. Britain's post-war air defense reforms, including improvements to its radar net and fighter interception procedures, were built on their experience, shooting down thousands of buzz bombs. The United States studied the same lessons when building radar chains like the WWII and SAGE command systems. The concept of defending cities from fast, low-flying threats came straight from the V-1 campaign. The V-1 also forced a dramatic cultural shift in how nations viewed unmanned weapons in warfare. Before the German flying bombs, unmanned aircraft were seen as experimental curiosities, useful perhaps as novelty target drones or remote-controlled tests. After the V-1, they were seen as serious, viable instruments of war. This shift opened the door to the drone revolution decades later. Reconnaissance UAVs in the Vietnam War, remote-controlled strike drones of the Gulf War, and the armed UAVs of the 21st century all trace their conceptual lineage back to the moment the first V-1 launched from northern France. It wasn't just a missile, it was the earliest symbol of pilotless attack aircraft. In the developing world, the V-1 had another legacy. It demonstrated that asymmetry could be weaponized effectively. A technologically inferior nation or a non-state actor in later years could build or acquire relatively simple unmanned weapons to strike far more advanced adversaries. This principle influenced missile programs in the Middle East, Asia, and beyond. Even in today's conflicts, the idea of cheap massed drones overwhelming expensive defenses mirrors the exact dynamic the V-1 introduced 80 years ago. In academia and engineering circles, the V-1 inspired a wave of study into guidance systems, pulse jet propulsion, and aerodynamic simplicity. Universities and aerospace agencies treated it as a bridge between World War II and the missile age, a real-world example of how minimalism in design could still achieve strategic impact. It became a case study in cost-effectiveness, a weapon that didn't rely on elegance but on brute efficiency. Finally, the V-1 had a profound ethical impact. Its use against civilian areas ignited post-war debates on the morality of unmanned, indiscriminate weapons. The idea that a machine could be launched, wander through the sky, and crash into a city without direct human oversight felt deeply unsettling yet uncomfortably prophetic. Modern discussions about autonomous drones, AI-guided munitions, and killer robots echo the same questions first asked in 1944. Who is responsible when a machine kills? The V-1 was the starting point of that dilemma. In the post-war world, the V-1 became more than a German weapon. It became a global catalyst, a spark that launched the age of cruise missiles, UAV warfare, and modern air defense strategy. Its legacy is not confined to museums or battlefield remnants. It lives on in every drone strike, every long-range cruise missile launch, and every modern defense system designed to stop fast, low-flying threats. The buzz bomb's shadow stretches far beyond the ruins of wartime Europe into the Cold War, into modern conflict, and into the future of unmanned warfare itself. The final survivors. By the dawn of the Cold War, the V-1 flying bomb had already entered the realm of legend, half-terror weapon, half-technological milestone. But while most were scrapped, dismantled, or cannibalized for post-war missile programs, a handful of these crude but iconic machines managed to survive the turbulence of history. Their final journeys after raining destruction across Europe took them into quiet museum halls, forgotten storage depots, remote test ranges, and the collections of nations that once feared them. The story of the V-1's survivors is a strange and sometimes dramatic epilogue to the world's first operational cruise missile. The first category of survivors consists of intact wartime captures. During the Allied advance, British, American, and Soviet forces seized launch ramps, assembly sites, and partially assembled Fieseler V-103 airframes. Many of these were shipped back home for analysis, test firing, or reverse engineering. A number were fired in post-war experiments and destroyed on impact. but the ones kept for study eventually found their way into national museums. These specimens, though classified at first, became valuable public exhibits once secrecy faded. They were the earliest survivors' machines saved not for sentiment, but for science. Britain preserved several of these captured V-1s. Today, visitors to the Imperial War Museum in London can stand beneath a restored V-1 suspended from the ceiling, a silent reminder of the summer of 1944, when its buzzing engine meant terror. The Royal Air Force Museum at Cosford holds another example, displayed near the engines and radars that once defended Britain from it. These museum pieces are not simply artifacts, they represent a chapter of national endurance. Their presence is a testament to the layered story of Britain's air defence, where radar operators, anti-aircraft gunners, and fighter pilots worked together to stop the crude but deadly robot bomb. The United States collected even more specimens due to extensive post-war testing. Many of these missiles were used in the JB-2 Loon development program, but some unused airframes survived in storage. The National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C., and the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton both display V-1 or JB-2 airframes, each telling a slightly different story. The American versions often appear in near-pristine condition, showing the clean lines of the reproduction models manufactured by Republic Aviation. These survivors illustrate not just German engineering, but also America's rapid adaptation of enemy technology. Elsewhere, surviving V-1s have found homes in Europe. France, Norway, the Netherlands, and Poland all host museum examples, some original, some reconstructed from wartime fragments. Many sit near the landscapes where the buzzing bombs once flew, giving visitors a visceral sense of proximity to the past. The La Coupole Museum in northern France, built within a former V-weapon bunker, features restored V-1 components alongside the colossal structures that once protected them. In these locations, the V-1 is part of a larger narrative of occupation, resistance, and liberation. The Soviet Union also collected a small number of V-1s after the war, though few were preserved for public display. Most were destroyed during testing or stripped for the 10Ko program. A handful eventually found their way into Russian aviation museums, where they sit quietly among Cold War missile giants, now dwarfed by the weapons they indirectly helped inspire. Aside from museum pieces, some of the most unusual survivors are test-range relics. In the deserts of the American Southwest, wreckage from JB-2 trials still lies scattered in remote areas, occasionally discovered by hikers or researchers. These fragments, twisted metal, rusted pulse jet segments, or shattered wings, tell a quieter story of the V-1's afterlife as a scientific tool. They are unofficial survivors, but survivors nonetheless, marking the missile's footprint across continents it was never meant to reach. There are also reconstructed survivors, painstakingly rebuilt from partial components or salvaged wreckage. Aviation enthusiasts, restoration groups, and museums have spent decades sourcing missing parts pulse jets from one country, fuselage fragments from another to resurrect complete examples. These reconstructions often stand in places where original specimens were too rare or too damaged to recover. Though not entirely authentic, they preserve the form and presence of the weapon for future generations. What makes these survivors especially fascinating is not merely their rarity, but the contrast between their wartime purpose and their peaceful afterlives. Once instruments of terror, designed to strike cities without warning, they now sit harmlessly behind glass or mounted on museum stands. Children walk past them, historians study them, engineers marvel at their simplicity. They are no longer feared, only examined. Yet every surviving V-1 carries weight. Its crude pulse jet, its steel fuselage, and its once deadly warhead compartment offer a glimpse into a brutal chapter of modern warfare. Unlike tanks or aircraft, the V-1 had no pilot, no crew, no human story inside its metal shell. That absence, the hollow interior where a cockpit should have been, is part of what made it so terrifying. The survivors embody that eerie quality, a weapon that was alive only because of its engine, not because of the people who built or launched it. Today, fewer than 24 intact V-1s remain worldwide. They are scattered relics preserved for education and remembrance. Their story is not one of glory, but of innovation born from desperation. and their survival ensures that the origins of unmanned warfare are never forgotten. Through them, the world can trace the lineage from the crude flying bomb of 1944 to the precision-guided drones and cruise missiles that define strategic conflict today. Conclusion. History often remembers wars by their battles, their generals, their treaties, and their turning points. But sometimes, the clearest echo of a conflict is not a place or a person, it is a machine. A device built with a purpose so stark, so brutally simple, that it outlives the generation that forged it. The V-1 flying bomb, the world's first operational cruise missile and one of the earliest suicide UAVs ever fielded, remains one of those machines. Its engine has long since fallen silent, but its shadow stretches across decades, shaping the evolution of warfare and the memory of nations. As we reach the end of this journey, it becomes clear that the fate of the V-1 cannot be understood merely through the lens of military history. It is a story of desperation, innovation, destruction, and transformation. A story of how a crude steel tube with wings changed the trajectory of modern conflict more than its designers could have ever imagined. And a story of how war leaves behind remnants physical and emotional that persist long after the weapons themselves have rusted away. During its brief but violent operational life in 1944-45, the V-1 represented both the terror and the ambition of its creators. Its pulse-jet engine's unmistakable drone struck fear into millions living under the threat of bombardment. Its mechanical simplicity, in stark contrast to the technologically sophisticated aircraft that opposed it, made it mass-producible, cheap, and ruthlessly effective. It was a weapon designed not to win the war, but to prolong it, not to break armies, but to break spirits. And yet, in its crude simplicity, lay the blueprint for future ages of remote warfare. When Germany collapsed in 1945, the V-1 story did not end, it mutated. Abandoned in forests, shoved into bunkers, left half-assembled on factory floors, the weapon became a prize for the victors. Engineers from the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union flocked to seize what remained of Germany's secret arsenal. To them, the flying bomb was not just a terror weapon, but a treasure chest of ideas. They dismantled its engines, examined its gyroscopes, dissected its airframe, and compared its flight performance with wartime intelligence. Many missiles were destroyed in the process. Some were fired in post-war tests, others were quietly scrapped. But from those remains, nations extracted concepts that would become cornerstones of Cold War military doctrine. This transformation, from a destructive weapon to a technological seed, marks one of the most remarkable shifts in the legacy of the V-1. It began its life as a tool of vengeance, yet it ended up guiding the development of weapons designed not merely to intimidate cities, but to cross oceans, evade radars, and strike with surgical precision. Cruise missiles that shaped conflicts in the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond, Tomahawks, Kh-55s, and others, can trace elements of their lineage back to the humble V-103. The V-1's pulse jet, primitive by modern standards, laid the groundwork for propulsion experiments that sparked new opportunities. Its stabilization systems, though mechanical, helped set the stage for inertial guidance breakthroughs. Even its launch methods, ramps, catapults, and aerial deployment profoundly influenced missile doctrine. Yet the V-1's legacy is not purely technological. Culturally and psychologically, it became a symbol one that nations struggled to interpret. For those who lived under its shadow, like the residents of London, Antwerp, and Liège, it represented fear, randomness, and the fragility of life during wartime. For the engineers who studied it after the war, it represented innovation, mechanical audacity, and the possibilities of unmanned flight. For modern audiences, viewing it in museums or documentaries, it represents something else entirely, the beginning of an era where machines could deliver destruction without risking a pilot's life. In many ways, the V-1 was an early whisper of the unmanned future we live in today. But perhaps the most poignant part of this story lies with the few survivors that remain. Museums across Europe and America display restored V-1s as relics of a time when technology was brutal, simple, and unforgiving. These missiles, once instruments of terror, now rest quietly behind ropes and glass, stripped of their power and left only with their history. Children walk past them without understanding the dread they once inspired. Engineers admire them as stepping stones in aviation development. Veterans view them with mixed emotions: anger, fear, nostalgia, fascination. In these survivors, we find the full arc of the V-1's life, from conception to destruction to study to remembrance. Yet even as we examine the remains, we cannot ignore the ghosts scattered across forests, coasts, swamps, and forgotten military ranges. Rusted fragments, half-buried fuselages, unexploded warheads sealed beneath decades of soil. These remnants form the archaeological footprint of a weapon that once reshaped the skies of Europe. They are the silent bones of a machine that refused to vanish completely, and in each rusting shard lies a message. History may age, but it never fully disappears. What makes the V-1 story resonate so deeply is not simply that it was the first cruise missile, but that it embodies the paradox of human ingenuity. Humanity's creative brilliance produced a weapon capable of traveling faster and farther than many piloted aircraft of its era. But that same ingenuity was harnessed for destruction. The V-1 is a reminder of how fragile the line can be between innovation that lifts humanity forward and innovation that pulls it toward darkness. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about technological progress, that every breakthrough carries risk, that every new capability can be bent toward violence or peace, that the future often begins in moments of crisis, not triumph. As Knightley, your narrator, reflects on the path this weapon took, he acknowledges the dual nature of historical memory. The V-1 is not a tale of heroes or villains alone. It is a tale of choices, consequences, and unintended legacies. It is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, but also a warning about the destructive potential of unchecked ambition. And that brings us to the emotional core of this conclusion. When I walk through museums and see a V-1 hanging above me, I don't just see bolts, rivets, and steel. I see the crowded shelters of London during air raid nights. I see the engineers in Peenemünde drawing sketches under pressure. I see American technicians firing JB-2 loons in the Mojave Desert. I see Soviet analysts dismantling captured airframes under dim bunker lights. I see children decades later staring curiously at a weapon that once shook empires. Every relic tells a story not just of war but of human choices. War machines by their nature are designed for destruction. But their stories do not end when the battles stop. The V-1 teaches us that history is defined not only by the moment a weapon is fired, but also by what happens afterward, by the debris left behind, the technologies it inspires, the memories it implants, and the lessons it forces us to learn. The echoes of war linger not in the explosions, but in the quiet spaces where the remnants rest. And so, as we close this chapter, I invite you not as viewers, but as fellow travelers to continue exploring these forgotten corners of history with me. Beneath every abandoned bunker, every rusted engine, every relic in a museum lies a story waiting to be told. Stories of innovation, fear, courage, and consequence, stories that define who we were and shape who we are becoming. If you want to walk deeper into these shadows with me, through lost prototypes, ancient battlegrounds, and the silent wrecks left behind by the great conflicts of our past, then stay with this channel. There are countless echoes of war still waiting in the dark, and together we will bring them into the light.